So welcome, everyone. This session will be recorded and it will last 60 minutes, about 45 minutes of presentation, followed by some time for questions and answers. Please keep your microphone muted during the presentation and please turn off your cameras while the presentation is going on. If you have a question or comment, please enter it into the chat during the presentation and it will be addressed during the question and answer period afterwards. You may also ask questions with video and audio during the question and answer portion. All participants in today's event will have access to the recorded version, which will be available within 1 week after the live event. My name is Dr. Catherine Showalter, and I will be the moderator for today's presentation. TESOL International Association's Speech, Pronunciation, and Listening Interest section is pleased to present this webinar titled Maintaining Pronunciation Intelligibility in International Settings, What Teachers and Researchers Should Know. Our speaker is Dr. Veronica Thur from the University of Passau in Germany. We are very pleased to welcome all of you to this webinar. And now it is my pleasure to hand this over to our speaker, Veronica.
Thank you so much. Thank you for this kind introduction. Thank you everybody for joining me today. So first of all, I'd like to briefly get to know you a little bit better as an audience. So some of you have already done it. For example, Beatrice has sent us greetings from Bolivia, and it would be really great if you could just briefly type into the chat from where you're joining us today, and also the context in which you're working. So are you a teacher, or are you a researcher, or maybe you're even both, a teacher and a researcher? So that would be great to know for me. And yeah, in the meantime, I'll be trying to share my screen with you. I hope it works. Yeah, I see from Iran. Welcome. Exciting. Okay, very good. So I think Colorado, Chicago. Oh, that's great. That's great. Wonderful, wonderful. That's great. And I'm very pleased to see that lots of teachers are here, because as I announced in my abstract for this webinar, I would like also to know about the views of teachers regarding international intelligibility. So I really hope, yeah, there it is. My slide is working now. So the first part of the webinar, I'd like to give you a little bit more input and start with a few general things concerning intelligibility, talk about factors that influence pronunciation intelligibility with a focus on international settings. So English as a lingua franca settings, where people use English as a lingua franca. And at the end, during the discussion, I would be really grateful if you could share your viewpoints regarding issues of pronunciation intelligibility in international contexts and actual classroom practice. So what would you need from researchers in order to, put our recommendations into practice? Or is there anything that is still missing in research, an issue that you noticed? And it's wonderful to see even more people posting their locations. Wonderful. Argentina, wow. And Japan. It's wonderful to see so many people from all over the world. And it's wonderful that this is also a webinar, which is an international context. So we are using English as a lingua franca here. I'm using English as a lingua franca with you. Good. Okay, so the first part would be very much what I, from my perspective as a researcher, would, teachers and other researchers like to know. And then at the end, it's your turn to tell the researchers what you think we should know and what you think we should also pay attention to. Good. So first of all, I'd like to mention that intelligibility is quite a complex concept. So it's also defined in various different terms. Sometimes it's used, the term intelligibility is used very broadly, and sometimes it's used with a more specialized meaning. And one framework of intelligibility that has influenced me quite strongly is the one by Mandro and Derving, which some of you might already know, where you distinguish between intelligibility, comprehensibility, and accentedness. And it's quite important to keep these three dimensions of speech separate from each other to distinguish between them. So intelligibility is really the extent to which you understand an utterance, which is not the same as your perceived ease of understanding. And it's also not the same as the perceived degree of accentedness of a person. So you can be very intelligible while you have a very strong accent. And you can be intelligible, although the perception of the listener is maybe that you're a little bit hard to understand. So these dimensions are at least partially independent from one another. Now I'm using the term intelligibility very much in this sense, a quite broad definition. And when I talk about pronunciation intelligibility, I simply mean any dimension of understanding that is affected by pronunciation. So that could be, for example, word recognition, which words you identify in the stream of speech, but it could also be speaker intention, which, for example, is affected by intonation in English. So this is what I mean when I say pronunciation intelligibility. Okay, 2 points I would like to stress about intelligibility is that it is, first of all, interactive. So it is really a two-way street, a shared responsibility between speaker and listener. And it is also essentially relative. So you are never intelligible, full stop. You're always intelligible with regard to a particular listener in a particular context. So we have various listener factors that affect intelligibility and also various situational factors, the context that affects intelligibility. And I'm going to talk about those a bit more in a minute. Okay, so today, that would be my plan for today. The factors affecting intelligibility, pronunciation intelligibility that I'm addressing today. And I've split them up into speaker-related factors, listener-related factors, and context-related factors. And I'd first like to address the speaker-related factors, although I will be a little bit brief regarding those because they have actually received quite a lot of attention from researchers and in discussions concerning international intelligibility in recent years. And the others are also very important, but haven't received that much attention so far. So I thought I would give the other two a bit more love today, a bit more focus. Good. So concerning the speaker-related factors, the question that concerns teachers all the time is what aspects of pronunciation should I focus on? With regard to international intelligibility, it's very important to keep in mind that native speaker norms are not directly relevant. So what matters is simply what international users, and these are very often non-native users of English, find important for mutual understanding. And there has been quite some research in recent years. One of them addresses a point that is quite prevalent, I feel, which is the segmental versus the suprasegmental debate. So should you focus on segmentals or should you focus on suprasegmentals in your teaching? And a lot of research in international context says that you should focus on the segments, that they are more important than the suprasegmental aspects in international communication. However, one important point is that a lot of these studies had data that contain very short turns, so conversational data where you take turns all the time. And this is different from when you, for example, produce longer stretches of speech. So if you produce a lecture, give a longer talk, of course, the suprasegmentals suddenly become more important again because they structure the discourse, they structure how you perceive the discourse. So here we might find differences in what is more important, segments or suprasegmental aspects. Okay, concerning specific segmental features, there have been various approaches. For example, the functional load approach, which basically sought to identify which sounds do the most work in the system of English and are therefore most important for intelligibility, and the lingua franca core by Jennifer Jenkins, which on the basis of empirical research sought to identify the most important segments. And you see her findings concerning the segments of English here. So the ones that are important. And there are some agreements between those two approaches, but also certain differences. So that's important to keep in mind. And then there was research concerning specific suprasegmental features, where Jenkins found that it is nuclear stress and chunking. So chunking your speech up into different parts seems to be crucial for international intelligibility, whereas other things that are very often taught, such as weak forms, are not that important. Okay, so now I've dumped a lot of information on you. So what does that mean for teachers? What could you make of this? We've seen that there are still some open questions, but there are also some tendencies that research identified. So notably regarding what is not that worth spending classroom time on, such as, for example, the TH sounds or the weak forms. But you will obviously always consider your learner needs and your difficulties, what your specific group of learners has trouble with, and focus on that anyways. Also concerning the speakers from different L1 backgrounds often have different needs in this respect. I'm a firm believer in the approach working on some things is better than nothing. So don't be overwhelmed, but because I think it's always a pity if people don't stop working on pronunciation in general because they don't know what to pick. I would say do some things because it helps already reduce the load for the listener a little bit. Usually learners have trouble with several sound substitutions, with several features of English pronunciation, and we don't really know yet what the combined effect of several sound substitutions are. And then suddenly things that don't seem to be such a big problem in isolation might become a problem again because they co-occur with lots and lots and lots of other things. And you can already reduce this load if you work on some things in your classroom. And it also allows learners to increase their feature repertoire and to, use a certain thing when they feel it's necessary for international communication. And a good idea is also to work on general speaking habits. And among the ones I've listed here on the slide, speech rate has emerged as quite crucial for international intelligibility. So it has been found that if you are too fast, and I hope very much that I'm not too fast myself today, because I tend to rush a little when I want to mention a lot of things. So if speech is too fast, it's just completely detrimental to international intelligibility. And a lot of good things get lost if you make this one mistake, for example, of just being a little too fast for your listeners. So that's one thing. If you notice this with a learner, you can focus on. I know that usually people want to get their learners to be fluent and get a bit faster, but actually in the studies, it was non-native speakers who were a little too fluent in this respect and really were too fast for the other interlocutor. Okay, so turning to listener-related factors. One quite obvious factor is how familiar a listener is with the speaker or a particular type of speech, or even a particular accent. So obviously, the more familiar you are with all those things, the easier it will be for you to understand a particular speaker. Another important aspect are language attitudes, and this might not be obvious. But it really is the case that if you have unfavorable attitudes towards a certain group of people, it can impact intelligibility of this group negatively. And a very interesting case is a study that is already from the States, from the 60s by Wolf in the Eastern Niger Delta. So there were two groups, the Nembe and the Kalabari. And based on linguistic criteria alone, Wolf found that they should be mutually intelligible. However, the interesting thing was that the Nembe said, oh yeah, we understand the Kalabari. but the Kalabari insisted that they would not understand the Nembe. Maybe a little bit, a few scattered words here and there. And the reason for this was that the Kalabari held very unfavorable attitudes towards the Nembe. So the Nembe were kind of the poor country cousins, and the Kalabari were economically and politically a lot more prestigious and the more powerful group. So that is a very striking example of how unfavorable attitudes can really impact intelligibility so negatively to such an extent that they actually claim that they wouldn't even understand the others except for a few words. So it relates very much to the question, do I actually want to understand the other person? Do I make an effort to understand them? And do I expect to understand them? Okay, another factor that is often mentioned is L1 background. There has been the idea of the interlanguage speech intelligibility benefit. So the idea that non-native speakers experience a benefit when listening to other non-native speakers, even maybe non-native speakers of the same L1 background. However, this idea is a little bit of a contested issue, and research findings vary a little. So there is a similar idea that is prevalent among ELF researchers, that sharing certain phonological features also affords people a benefit. So for example, if a non-native speaker shares certain phonological features in their L2 English with another non-native speaker, the idea would be that that affords them a benefit in understanding this person. And a bit of a controversial idea that has been put forward is that there is a difference between native and non-native speakers concerning their capability, concerning how skilled they are in international communication, simply relating to knowing how to play the rules of the game. Because very often native speakers might not realize yet that, you know, the English language now is used by many, many other people. It does not solely belong to them. It's also very deeply entrenched in their memory. And there has been certain tendencies observed that sometimes native speakers, you know, struggle a little bit with knowing how to adapt and overcome, knowing how to adapt and accommodate to their listeners, and also native speaker listeners struggling in, you know, accommodating receptively to a non-native speaker. So it relates to not expecting the other one to follow the rules of standard English or native speaker English as a listener. Just, you know, a tendency, and there are many, many native speakers who are very skilled international communicators because they know that they know how to play the rules, the new rules of the international game, and they are very good at that too. Okay, other factors that are sometimes mentioned are listening proficiency. So obviously, if somebody is a beginner listener, they will struggle more with understanding other people in international context than if you're a very advanced listener. Age has been mentioned, with very old participants sometimes struggling to understand accented speech. Aptitude, in the sense that some people are simply very gifted for understanding unfamiliar accents. And expertise, in the sense of that sometimes pronunciation testers and teachers or even linguists are too aware of, you know, certain pronunciation differences. They immediately focus on this, and then they are distracted, and they might be too aware of what is going on at the moment and not focus on the content of the message. Good. Okay, so again, so what does that mean for classroom practice? Obviously, we as teachers cannot control who our learners are going to communicate with out there. But what you can do is you can raise awareness that depending on who they are talking to, they might have to pay more attention to their pronunciation. So obviously, I mean, sometimes, you know, learners say, but my friends understand me, and I know that I'm understandable because they do, but you spend a lot of time with your friends. They are very familiar with you. They also like you as a person. So there might be differences depending on who you're talking to. So this is something that people should know. And you can also raise their awareness for their responsibility as listeners, so that other people are more intelligible to them, and for the new rules of international communication. And you can practice phonological accommodation with them, both receptive and productive. So I would like to draw your attention to a book by Robin Walker in this respect, because he offers quite interesting and useful ideas for activities on how to do this. Okay, so now I've dumped a lot of information on you again, and I think it's time for a little discussion. So I'd like to take some time, like maybe 5 minutes, and send you into breakout groups, and have you discuss what your students in your context, be they native speakers or non-native speakers, think of other non-native accents or of non-native accents in general. So do you think they have positive views? Do you think they have negative views? And are they aware of the new rules of international communication? So are they open to others breaking the rules? Are they open to themselves maybe sometimes breaking the rules for the purpose of effective communication? Okay, thank you so much for participating. I hope you had fun and you had enough time to at least discuss a little bit. Maybe we can address some of these issues then later in the discussion again. For the time being, I'd like to move on to the next topic, which is kind of my favorite topic, I have to say, because I dealt with it in my own research and in my PhD thesis. So there we go. And those would be the context-related factors that affect intelligibility. I'm going to do a brief overview of those affecting the quality of the acoustic signal before I move on to those that are related to the processing of the signal, which is very much my field of expertise. Okay, so one thing that is obvious, I think, to all of you is that things such as background noise negatively affect intelligibility, speech intelligibility, but also speech transmission systems, talking on the phone, talking via Zoom. So I hope I'm intelligible or more or less intelligible to you today. Even masks, because they can, they muffle speech a little bit. So this can have a negative impact. Another thing that affects the quality of the acoustic signal and thereby intelligibility is the social context. So the formal, the degree of formality, and we also have task effects. So if you're in a formal context, people very often pay a lot more attention to their speech. They monitor their pronunciation, how clearly or accurately they pronounce. And depending on the type of task they are engaged in, so how much of their cognitive resources are already consumed by the task, they have more or less resources available for monitoring speech. And this will also affect how intelligible they can be or can try to be. And then we have certain factors that kind of indirectly affect the quality of the signal, because they affect whether a speaker is actually able to modify the signal and their input in reaction to listener feedback. So this very much relates to communicative setting. So is it a monologic setting or is it a dialogic setting? Are you sitting in a lecture and you basically don't really know, the speaker basically doesn't really know, okay, do people understand or not? And they can't really accommodate, you can't really negotiate meaning, or are you, in a conversation where you could signal that you have not understood anything, and accordingly the speaker could then adjust their pronunciation or adjust their speech in general. So all this affects pronunciation intelligibility. And then we have the factors that relate to the processing of the signal. And here we need to look at the process of listening in more detail again. So cognitively speaking, listening is a very interactive process. So you do not just process the signal from the bottom up. You also do this, but you also use top-down information. So you use higher linguistic levels, higher linguistic information, and extra linguistic information when you listen to somebody. And you use these processes even if you already identify sounds in the stream of speech and if you recognize words in the stream of speech. So all this depends on not only on the acoustic input you get, but also on certain linguistic and extra linguistic sources of information. For example, visual context. So many people find it hard to understand people wearing masks, not only because speech is muffled a little, but because you don't see the movements, you don't see the facial expression and the mouth movements. And we also rely on gestures, obviously, and on other things we see lying around. We rely on linguistic context, on sentence context and on the larger discourse context. And we rely on our background knowledge and our world knowledge. And all this helps us anticipate words in the stream of speech and makes processing more efficient. So this is how it works in general. This is considered a general cognitive process, but is this also how it works in international communication? So Jenkins actually questioned this and said, no, not necessarily. And she observed in her data that many non-native speakers seem to rely too much on the acoustic signal. So they have difficulties with top-down skills and in making use of context and context when they process the acoustic signal. And she even attributed this type of processing behavior to L2 users at upper intermediate level and above. So arguably users that are already quite advanced, because upper intermediate level and above that already goes into low advanced level. However, I'm not, I'm a little bit critical of this view because it was based, first of all, it goes against these, very general assumptions concerning the listening process. And it also was based on rather little data. And there are a couple of other studies from the field of second language acquisition, but also from the field of international communication that suggested that actually these very same listening processes and cognitive processes also apply in international communication for non-native listeners. And this is also what my own research has shown, and I'd like to give you a few examples. So for example, I conducted a qualitative study in which I observed how non-native international listeners rely on visual context. And I had a pair of non-native international listeners do a map task, and you see the part of the map that the listener in this instance was looking at. And in this case, the speaker said, "Do you have the birds? 3 birds." And during the follow-up interview, which I conducted, the listener mentioned that this kind of tree that was kind of an issue for them, but actually it was resolved immediately because they just looked at their map and they saw, okay, I have 3 birds on my map. Obviously, my partner intends to refer to these 3 birds. So it was no issue at all during the conversation. It would have passed unnoticed if the listener wouldn't have mentioned it during the interview. So clearly they were relying on visual context when they were, making sense and of what their partner was saying. I also conducted quantitative research with a large-scale listening experiment that involved several hundred people from various different L1 backgrounds, and they completed a listening close. And I had 4 conditions in this experiment that differed in the availability of cotextual and contextual cues. And I also incorporated the variable of listening proficiency in this experiment because I wanted to find out whether, listeners at different proficiency level maybe differ in how much they rely on cotext and context. And this affects, the extent to which context and context then benefits intelligibility for them. Okay, so I suggest you try this out. So I made a very, very, very short demo version of the 4 conditions of my experiment. Thank you so much, Kate, for posting the links in the chat. And I would ask you to try one of them. So try either part 1, part 2, part 3, or part 4. And I would ask you to simply pick a part according to your birth month, because this gives us a nice way of kind of artificially randomizing into which group you go to. So depending on the month in which you were born, please try out one part of the experiment. And I'll give you about 5 minutes to do so. If it doesn't work, don't worry. I know that in some parts of the world, this thing might crash simply due to restrictions of the internet, which are beyond my understanding of computers and artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Don't worry, this might happen. It's no problem at all. Then you can just, take a little break and wait until the others are back. Okay, so I hope you have fun. Okay, I hope you had the chance to try it out a little bit. Some parts are a little bit quicker than others. Good. So now let's have a look at what you actually did. Now let's see what you actually did. So those of you who tried part 1, you tried the control condition. So that's the condition where there is no context or context whatsoever, and you simply listen to, isolated words. Those of you who tried part 2 tried what I called the SIN condition. And in this condition, I measured the influence of purely grammatical information on intelligibility. So the idea was that you have a very neutral sentence that simply indicates the part of speech of the word, such as in the example here. And then the listener knows, okay, the word that is going to follow is, for example, an adjective, as in here, as here. In the part 3, so those of you who tried part 3, you also had a semantic cue on top of the syntactic cotext. So this cue would indicate an additional aspect of the target word. So not only would you know that the word to follow would, for example, be a noun due to the syntactic cotext, but for example, here, feather is semantically related to bird. So that would also give you a clue as to the identity of the word. And in the last condition, you would have a schematic cue, so a world knowledge cue. You would receive like a little description of the situation. Imagine a certain context of which you have some sort of world knowledge, for example, at the airport. And then you would also know what type of word is going to follow due to the cotext, and this would also indicate to you what word you might expect, such as bag instead of bag, although the speaker quite clearly says bag, but with all the information you got, you might actually suppose that he means bag. So this is what I did in the experiment, and I found that actually cotext and contextual information benefited intelligibility for my international listeners from the intermediate level upwards. So also groups of listeners which Jenkins suspected to actually not benefit that much from cotext and context, they profited. And I did find that listening proficiency regulated the extent to which you benefit. So it regulated the size of the effect of cotext and context, but still I found quite profound benefits when you have context to help you. So great that they may even override other effects. For example, differences in intelligibility between certain features. So in conclusion, I found that cotext and context really matter quite a lot for international intelligibility. So what does that mean now again for classroom practice? So again, you won't be able to control the conditions under which your students will communicate in the real world. We are just not able to do that. But there are a few things we might be able to do. So again, we might have to raise their awareness for differences in in contextual condition, so that sometimes they will just have to pay particular attention to their pronunciation, be that because the quality of the signal itself is affected because they are on the phone, or be it because their listeners just can't rely on much else besides, you know, the acoustic signal. For example, also on the phone, when you, in addition to having reduced quality of the signal, you don't see the other person. If you have a lack of world knowledge, this is also another factor. So they have to think a little bit of their audience when they speak. You can practice contextualizing. So when a breakdown occurs, trying to push the listener into the right direction. I mean, this is a very, very general communication strategy, I would say, that many people do anyways, but that some people might still need help with developing. And concerning listening, you can practice relying on context and context. And this is a general listening strategy that is already practiced anyways, if you look at the listening literature. So it's called predicting and guessing on the basis of background knowledge or on the basis of what was already said. But the research we have now just shows that this is also particularly important in international communication. Okay, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was of interest to you and you're taking some things from this talk today. And I'm excited to hear your questions now and to hear your views on what you would like researchers to do, what we should have a look at, and what we maybe should you know, develop so that you can address these things in the classroom. Anything that comes to your mind. Thank you so much.
Thank you. We are mindful that we are getting close to time, but if someone does have a question, please feel free to unmute or unvideo yourself if you would like to ask, or you may put it into the chat and I will be happy to relay it to our speaker for you. So if you do have any questions or comments or suggestions on how to use this information in the classroom or other such things, please feel free. Got some shy people in the audience. I do have a question. So one of the things that I work with a lot is orthographic representation, so visual information. And I was wondering, you brought up in the one example that like the 3 birds was helpful to see. Is there any indication that in certain contexts, visual information, whether that be pictures or another type of just contextual cue through the visual input, that would be a hindrance to being able to accommodate to a speaker?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. What do you mean with a hindrance to accommodate? So that you mean that they rely, that they think, okay, the context is doing the work for me. So right. I don't.
Yeah, that maybe they're relying on that visual input and it leads them astray from what they're actually hearing.
Oh yes, that's a very good, yeah, I had instances like this in my data too. So that you're basically misled by the visual input, that you think okay, it must be this because that is what I see. I had not that much data, unfortunately, for my because it was a qualitative study, but I had a very interesting instance where I was always wondering whether the participant had been primed. So they had they had a spot the difference task, which was very decontextualized. So they had just a grid and the other person was telling them the objects that they had in their grid. And one of them had a cab and quite clearly pronounced cab. And the other person even said, you mean cap with, and then the speaker said, no cab, C-A-B. So he said C-A-B and even spelled it out. And the listener said, okay, got it. And still noted down cap with P. And afterwards I said, yeah, but you talked about this, you negotiated this, so what happened here? And he said, I don't know what happened. I was completely convinced that he said cap. I didn't even listen properly to what he was saying anymore. I was so convinced that he said cap. Even when he spelled it for me, I was like, no, I'm convinced. And I was always wondering whether he was primed by the visual context that he had, because he actually had in a few cells in his grid, he had a hat just above, and he was looking at this hat all the time and probably thought, okay, I have a hat, he probably has a cap, and didn't even bother to. So sometimes they pay to, this was a very interesting finding, because Jenkins claimed in her study that people were paying too much attention to the acoustic signal. And in these instances, at least in my data, people sometimes ignored the acoustic signal. So they were, no, I'm don't mind that. I'm pretty sure I got what they said. I mean, the stakes were also not very high for my participants, but this can happen. You're right. Yeah.
Interesting. Thank you. Other questions from the audience? Again, feel free to either unmute yourself or type it into the chat box, and I'm happy to relay it. But are there any other questions or comments from the audience?
Thank you for the thank yous.
We've got one. So Kathleen says, I was surprised when I did a listening exercise in my monolingual classroom. Students were assigned to give dictations to the class from sentences they had already heard. Some dictators were unintelligible to even their own classmates. Why would this happen?
Yeah, this is because also you're talking about a monolingual classroom, right? And there have all been all these hypotheses that, speakers from the same L1 background, they should be, more intelligible to one another. Okay, so they had already heard some dictators were unintelligible. I mean, I have to say, I sometimes find fellow Austrians not that intelligible, because I listen a lot to different, also native speech, but so some listeners still find it hard to listen to speech from their own L1 background. It's an interesting question. It's of course very difficult for me to say why this happened, because there are different possibilities for different reasons. But I'm as surprised as you are because I expect them to be very familiar with one another. They should be quite familiar with one another. They have already heard the sentences. So even if they have already heard the sentences, some people still focus very much, surprisingly much, on the signal and show extreme resistance to using their background knowledge. So this can be an issue. This was also something that Jenkins found in her data, that some people showed surprising resistance in, for example, relying on visual cues, and might place an extreme amount of confidence in the acoustic signal. So that might be an explanation, that their listening strategies are somewhat different, and in this case not that successful.
Thank you. Any other final questions from the group or comments from the group? All right, with that, we will conclude today's program. Today's presentation was titled Maintaining Pronunciation Intelligibility in International Settings, What Teachers and Researchers Should Know. Special thank you to our presenter, and this concludes the program. You are now able and allowed to disconnect. Thank you so much for joining us today.